The window of opportunity for a NAFTA deal is closing and talks have moved into high gear. Negotiators still face some major sticking points, though, among them Canada's supply management system. The U.S. wants Canada to abolish it, but a new report says that would be a big mistake and that the U.S. should actually consider adopting its own supply management system. So how are Canadians benefiting from the system? Joining me now is Adam Taylor. He was a senior advisor to the former Minister of International Trade, Ed Fast. He's also co-founder of the group Export Action Global.
Thanks for having me.
So you did a big study about supply management. What is the big takeaway?
The big takeaway is that we've all been led to believe that we pay higher dairy prices in Canada because of supply management. We've been told that compared to the New Zealanders, to the Australians, and to the Americans, that we pay higher prices. We looked at some data, Nielsen data, and that data show that in fact that's false. We pay in fact lower prices than American counterparts and on par with other countries around the world.
So I feel like when I go to the store, I pay a lot for cheese. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong necessarily if you feel you pay too much, but the data show that in fact if you compare what you pay here in Canada to what you pay in markets across the United States, you actually pay less here than in the United States.
It's a relevant study, obviously, given the debate going on around the idea of supply management. We've heard the president directly attack our system, in fact. What about the American system? What can you tell us about that?
Well, the American system is still a highly regulated system like Canada's, but in some cases where they've pursued deregulation policies, they have swapped essentially regulation for massive subsidies, the subsidies that happen at the federal level, the state level, right into cities and towns where they subsidize animal feed and even water. And those are all subsidies that support American farmers, just as the same type of supply management system supports Canadian farmers. So every system has some level of government support, and that's the difference. Is in some cases it's direct and it's restricting imports and controlling production and managing consumption with production. In other cases it's direct subsidies paid for by taxpayers.
Why do you think that hasn't made it into the debate as much as we have been hearing specifically criticism of Canada's supply management system?
Yeah, well, in some cases it has been. It makes it into certain debates. You even have farmers in the United States saying we should actually have a system like Canada's. We see whether it's in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Farmers Union, and other farming groups saying, hey, we don't need more access to Canada. We actually need to implement Canadian-style supply management policies, and we're seeing that hasn't been a highly featured part of the debate thus far.
What do you think the implications of the conclusions your report reaches are for this as a sticking point in NAFTA?
Well, we believe that the data show that the Canadian model is actually, it creates stability for farmers, it creates stability for consumers. In many cases, prices are lower than in the United States. And so we think it actually shows that the Canadian model of managing consumption and production in the dairy sector is actually a good and stable, inducing way for the dairy sector to manage itself in Canada. And we're saying the Canadian government should look at keeping it because it's actually working quite well.
Do you think that argument will be persuasive in negotiations? And I ask because I'm not sure under Ed Fast if you were involved in CETA negotiations. I imagine you were, but we ended up capitulating on certain supply management aspects then. Do you foresee the same having to happen this time? Or?
Well, we've seen in successive trade negotiations giving away piece by piece the stability that Canada has actually does erode that very stability. So if you start to trade it away, trade deal by trade deal, you will compromise the stability that Canada has. So we're saying that, in fact, you should actually maintain and preserve the system, because we've actually even seen in Australia and New Zealand, a lot of those so-called exporting countries for dairy, they haven't actually seen much benefit in the long run. I mean, we see overproduction, which leads to price volatility, which actually leads to wasting product. So when you actually carefully manage production and consumption, as Canada's system does, it actually creates more stability for everybody.
Do you think it was a mistake to make those concessions in CETA?
I think in some cases where the concessions were made to find gains elsewhere, and so you give away something to get something, and then pledging compensation for the concessions where you did make concessions. I think that was a fair trade-off at the time, supported by agriculture groups. But I would say as long as you continue to trade it away piece by piece, you'll see support for those types of concessions actually not maintained, because it is actually eroding the very stability that the system provides.
So in this case, in NAFTA, if similar concessions were to be made, you'd think there'd be a real negative impact?
I think so. There's only so much you can give before the system actually no longer has that stable management of production and consumption. And our system, by controlling imports and controlling production and then having it all balance out, has actually created a system where we don't waste milk, where our farmers don't have price volatility, and then consumers don't have that same price volatility. So we think our system works well, and we should actually be preserving it.
Okay, good point to leave it at. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We want to let